Okay, we're back. In this section, we're going to talk about 3 dimensions of behavior, or ways to assess and measure behavior. So first, in terms of these dimensions of behavior, one way to measure behavior is to assess its duration. Now, duration refers to the length of a time a behavior occurs from its start to stop. So some examples here. Cecily ran for 30 minutes. So from when she started running to when she ended running, 30 minutes elapsed. That would be the duration of time she's engaging in the behavior. Finn played video games for 60 minutes. From when he started playing video games to when he ended playing video games, that would be considered the duration. Another way to measure behavior has to do with frequency or rate. Now, this is not measuring how long something occurs, but how many times the behavior occurs in a amount of time. So, for example, Rary bit her nails 12 times in 1 hour. So this is a count, a frequency, or a rate of occurrence of the behavior. Callahan opened the refrigerator 3 times in 30 minutes. Again, 3 is a count or an amount. Now, these measures are different than what we have up here with duration, and oftentimes they're good for behaviors that occur quickly. But I want you to note that we're still looking at how many times something occurs within a timeline, because Rary biting her nails 12 times in 1 hour might be different than Rary biting her nails 12 times within the course of 24 hours. Or Callahan opening the refrigerator 3 times in 30 minutes is different than Callahan opening the refrigerator 3 times within 6 hours. So we're looking at a count or an amount with frequency or rate. Now, another way to measure behavior is to assess its intensity or force, and this is often thought about as how much energy is involved in producing the behavior. Now, this can be pretty straightforward with some kinds of behavior. So Gray bench pressed 200 pounds. How much force is exerted here to press 20 pounds of a weight? That's pretty straightforward. But this can also be used to assess intensity of other kinds of behaviors, and scales could be used. For example, if some parents are trying to modify a child's tantrum, a parent might be asked to rate the intensity of the child's tantrum on a scale, and it might go from being very low, minimal, to very high, maximal. So intensity or force can also be rated on a scale like this. Now, these are 3 dimensions of behavior. As we continue, we're going to talk about other dimensions of behavior, because you might be thinking, well, this doesn't cover everything, and that's very true. This is just kind of an introduction. So as we continue, we'll be talking about latency of behavior, quality of behavior, topography of behavior. So there are other ways to measure behavior. These are just some ideas to get us started. We're also going to talk about behaviors being either overt or covert. So let's talk about what these 2 things mean and talk about some examples. So overt behavior refers to any behavior that is visibly observed or could be recorded by somebody else. So some examples of overt behaviors. So writing on a note card. If somebody's trying to increase studying behavior, they may decide that they're going to increase their use of note cards, and writing on a note card could be observed and recorded by somebody else. Talking on the phone is another example of an overt behavior. Somebody could see somebody talking on the phone, and they could record the person talking on the phone. And they could decide to record it in terms of frequency. How many times during the course of the day does somebody talk on the phone? Or they could record duration. How much time do they spend talking on the phone within 60 minutes? But this is a behavior that could be observed by somebody else. Eye contact is another example of overt behavior. If somebody is trying to feel more assertive or feel more socially engaged, they may decide that they're going to target eye contact behavior, and that could be measured by somebody else. How many times does somebody make eye contact? Another behavior that is clearly overt behavior is snacking behavior. Now again, that would need to be operationally defined, but it's something that could be observed by somebody else and recorded by somebody else. So overt behaviors are lots of different kinds of behaviors, but we also have these other covert, private, internal kinds of behaviors that we need to think about, because we might be interested in modifying some of these behaviors as well. So covert behaviors are private, internal. You might want to think about them as the kinds of behaviors that are not directly observed by others. They're more likely to be thought of as cognitive behaviors. Now, that doesn't mean we can't measure them and we can't observe them, but they would probably need to be observed by the person trying to change the behavior. It would be easier for somebody to self-observe than for somebody else to be observing these things. So any kind of private self-talk, the talk that we have to each other, whether it's a pep talk, come on, you can do this, or it might be a negative self-talk, oh wow, I'm going to fail. Any kind of thoughts, any kind of images, any kind of feelings, these are all considered covert, because somebody else can't see you doing these things. Somebody else can't see you having these negative thoughts or these mental images or these feelings. Now, that doesn't mean that they don't necessarily reflect behaviors. We can figure out a way to assess them, but the person who is engaging in the behavior has to be the one who's doing the measuring rather than somebody else. So some examples here. As you're completing a test, if you have these kinds of thoughts, oh my gosh, I'm going to fail this test. Now, the person might be having the thought. We have this child here working on some kind of an assignment, and gosh, my heart just goes out looking at this little guy, because it looks like he's got some fear there. Now, I don't know that because this is a covert, private, internal thought, but having that kind of thought, I'm going to fail this test, would be a covert behavior. Additionally, if a child is in class, or even in a college level class, have you ever had that thought, oh my gosh, I hope that the teacher doesn't call on me, I hope the professor doesn't call on me? That thought is a covert, private, internal thought. Now, we could try to come up with what that looks like in terms of behaviors, but we could also kind of ask the individual, how many times are you having this particular kind of a thought during the course of a class? All right, so we're going to be distinguishing between overt and covert kinds of behaviors. And in behavior modification, we can look at both of these things. All right, the last thing we're going to talk about in this video is the difference between labels and operational definitions. So we're going to be focusing on operational definitions, but we oftentimes see in society people using labels for things rather than operational definitions. So we've used some of these concepts a lot and have used lots of names for them. But when we use labels like anxious or shy or lonely, we've talked about these as kind of being the products of behavior, but to some extent they're also labels. They are labels that we use them when we communicate with each other. This person's very outgoing, this person's very anxious, this person is introverted. These are labels, and we use them all the time. Now, labels have the advantage, the benefit of making it very easy to communicate. So when I talk to you about somebody who is shy, or somebody who is lonely, or somebody who is extroverted, you can easily form a mental image of what this person looks like. So they facilitate our communication because we all have a general sense about what these things look like. What does anxious look like? What does shy look like? Or what does lonely look like? So it does facilitate our ability to communicate with each other because we can use labels. Now, in behavior modification, we would also see lots of disadvantages to using these labels. So let's talk about some of these disadvantages. One of the main disadvantages is that the use of these labels leads to lots of stereotyping. So if we know that somebody is shy, or somebody tells us that they are shy, we automatically form this mental image of what this person is going to look like, and we might be adding in lots of specific characteristics that may or may not be true for this individual. So it does lead to stereotyping. So by stereotyping, I mean that we have formed a general impression of what this person is going to be like, and we may see behaviors that are not necessarily even there, just because in our mind we have an idea about what anxious looks like, or what shy looks like, or what lonely looks like. So we may be overextending our ideas to this person just because we're using this label. Another big problem with using labels is it leads to something that's referred to as a pseudo-explanation. So by pseudo-explanation, we mean that the label is used to explain the behavior, but it doesn't explain why. So for example, if we're using this label of anxious, so we might see that Callahan, the third grader in class, is fidgety, he's moving around a lot, he is looking up at the clock a lot, he is wiggling in his seat, and he is starting to sweat. And we might decide to say that, oh, Callahan is feeling anxious. So we would attach the label of anxious to Callahan, but that's not really telling us why he is feeling anxious at the time. So we use these labels and we attach them to people when they go along with certain kinds of behaviors. But saying that somebody is anxious or saying that they are shy and saying that they are lonely doesn't really tell us why they are engaging in those particular kinds of behaviors. Do you see what I mean? It's a pseudo explanation. So saying that somebody is engaging in certain behaviors because they're lonely tells us that there's a label, but it doesn't really get to why they are lonely or why they are anxious or why they are shy. It doesn't really explain why the behavior is happening. So while behaviors can be labeled, and we can use labels, in behavior modification, we tend to focus on using what are called operational definitions. Now, my guess is you've heard of operational definitions in your other classes before, but let's talk about what they're going to mean for this class, because you're going to need to operationally define some of your own behaviors. So by operational definitions, we're talking about defining a behavior based on how it's being measured. So we're looking at what specific behaviors must occur to say that somebody is showing shy behaviors, or to say that they're showing lonely behaviors, or to say that they're showing anxious behaviors. What are the specific behaviors that must occur? What does this look like? All right, so let's think about this. Let's think about operational definitions and how they're different from labels with a quick exercise here. So I want you to think about, what would an operational definition for lonely be? Being lonely. What does being lonely mean? Now, you probably have some ideas. I want you to pause the video and in your notes write down what you think being lonely looks like. Now, this is what we're thinking about, not just like a psychological definition of what lonely means, but I want you to think about an operational definition. If we had to measure that in somebody, what would it look like? Now, if it helps, I'm going to give you a picture here. And this is a picture that I found when I just typed in lonely. So I want you to think about, what are the behaviors involved in being lonely? And now as a class, I want us to be thinking about, what are the overt behaviors? Now remember, the overt behaviors are the ones that we can easily see, that we could measure. So if we're considering this person to be lonely, we are told that this person is lonely. What are the operational definitions here? What are the behaviors? Well, we might be measuring time spent by self, not with others. We might be measuring frequency of social contacts, not having a lot of social contacts. We might be measuring body language of this particular person, so head hung low, shoulders low. Kind of looking down, not making eye contact. If we were around this person, we might be seeing things like a voice being quieter and low levels of talking, not talking very much in a chunk of time. This might be part of our operational definition for being lonely in terms of overt behaviors, behaviors that are easy for us to see and measure being somebody else. Now, what about covert behaviors? Because you're probably thinking about those too. Now, these are the ones that would be harder for us to see, but if we asked somebody to kind of self-reflect on being lonely, how would that look? So some covert behaviors. Well, that might be perceived low levels of social support. So if we give this individual a social support scale, how much social support do they perceive that they have from people in their life? They might be rating that to be somewhat low. We could ask them to report on negative emotions and see how much they are reporting certain negative emotions. So if we ask them on some kind of a scale, how lonely do you feel? Their self-report here would be a covert aspect of their behavior. We can't see that, but they can self-report that. We could measure self-reported maladaptive thinking. So maladaptive thinking would be thoughts that are not necessarily helpful. So how frequently does this person think that I don't really have any friends, or this person really doesn't want to spend time with me, or I'm here but nobody would miss me if I weren't here. Those might be maladaptive thoughts that aren't necessarily helpful, and we could ask the person to self-report these things. Now, these are just some ideas. I'm sure that you have even better ideas, but I want you to be thinking about, in terms of being lonely, what are some overt behaviors? What would that look like from somebody else's perspective? And covert behaviors, what would that look like? If we were to ask the person, kind of internally to self-reflect on this. Okay, the last thing we're going to talk about in this video is the difference between a behavioral deficit and a behavioral excess. So as part of your behavior change project, we're going to be talking about behaviors that occur too infrequently and too frequently. So a behavioral deficit is any kind of a behavior that doesn't occur enough. Now, again, you might be thinking, well, that depends, but it's up to the individual to determine if something is occurring not enough or too much. So behavioral deficits, these are behaviors that don't occur enough. So in this class, we've had lots of people looking at behavioral deficits. So studying behavior might not be occurring enough. Exercising might not be occurring enough. Meditating might be not occurring enough. Saying thank you or praising others, saying positive things to other people might not be occurring enough. With children, it might be brushing teeth. They're not brushing their teeth enough, or they're not washing their hands enough. They might be not engaging in enough positive self-statements, so kind things, looking in the mirror and saying, wow, you look fantastic today. That's a positive self-statement. Smiling might not be occurring enough. These are all examples of behaviors that could be behavioral deficits. On the other hand, we can talk about a behavior that's a behavioral excess. It's something that occurs too much. Now, all of the things that appear here as behavioral deficits could be behavioral excesses. It just depends upon the person. In the past, students have looked at consuming too much sugar. That's an excess, or caffeine, or smoking, or alcohol. It could be any of these things. Watching too much TV, playing video games too much, shopping too much. Now, these are typically not things that we think of as deficits. People are not usually, I want to increase my TV watching behavior. These are typically behavioral excesses. Scrolling through social media, engaging in critical statements, saying things that are not very nice to other people. Hand washing behavior might be a behavioral excess. Especially as we look at individuals that have obsessive compulsive disorder, that might be considered a behavioral excess. They're washing their hands too much. Frowning might be a behavioral excess. Complaining might be a behavioral excess. These are all behaviors that we may want to decrease. So as we start to think more about behaviors, we want to think about if they're overt or covert. We want to make sure we can come up with operational definitions, and we want to think about if they are deficits not occurring enough, or excesses that are occurring too much. Okay, we're going to take a break and we'll come back and talk more about the field of behavior modification.